The question of whether or not the slavery reparations would be paid has become increasingly contentious. People now seldom think that slavery reparations will ever be paid since the subject has been made to seem so esoteric. However, what if we said that this subject is being discussed at the highest level and in the United States? Reparations for slavery must be paid immediately since the U.S. government has financed a wide range of endeavors, including peacekeeping, conflicts, and many more that we are unable to mention here. The United States is no longer able to avoid it as a moral obligation. Furthermore, the first restoration estimate was $350,000. The amount per person has now been increased to $151 million. The concern is, though, who will foot the bill considering that only 14% of Americans are black? Will all African Americans receive the money for reparations on top of that? This video will alter your perspective on slavery reparations, so watch it. Why do the offspring of white supremacists continue to profit from the wealth accumulated by slave owners if African Americans are not entitled to compensation for the wrongs committed against their forebears? This demonstrates the weaknesses in the opposition to reparations argument. Prior analyses from a number of state agencies and economists recommended giving $360,000 to every African American. But everyone was aware that this was insufficient. The U.S. just wanted to pay a small sum to end the generations-long duty. This sum has now been increased to $151 million. This amount is adequate for a lot of people. Still unanswered is, who would foot the bill for the reparations? Knowing that the sum will approach trillions of trillions is crucial to determining if it is feasible or not. Since no government can afford to spend so much, a number of recommendations have been made. Using the riches and territory that the descendants of white nationalists currently possess is one proposal. The main contention is that money accumulated by white slave owners, built on the work of African Americans who were held as slaves, did not magically disappear when slavery was abolished. Rather, it has been inherited by successive generations, giving their offspring financial benefits. There are now glaring differences between white and black Americans' wealth, opportunity, and educational attainment as a result of historical injustice. Slavery caused great pain and trauma to both the enslaved and their offspring. It was an extremely immoral institution that existed for centuries in the United States. Action must be taken to address this injustice. At first, it was proposed that reparations should be handled by the federal government. The claim was that by using federal legislation and constitutional protections, the federal government actively encouraged slavery. As such, the creation of a special reparations fund is essential. The descendants of white supremacist slave owners shouldn't keep the wealth created by slavery either. If it is claimed that the descendants of former slaves shouldn't get reparations as they weren't subjected to the atrocities themselves, this fortune would have to be seized if it came to that. Who is the real owner of this wealth? This money unquestionably belongs to the descendants of slaves who still experience structural and systematic racism, both morally and legally. Black Americans have suffered greatly from racism's financial effects, which are estimated to have reached a startling $70 trillion since the end of slavery. This high expense is closely linked to a previous wealth gap. In 2016, the average middle-class white family in the United States had collected wealth of $149,703, while black families had accumulated wealth of only $1,324, or 8.6% of what white families had. The continuing legacy of slavery is the reason for this financial disparity, according to Sean Rochester, author of The Black Tax: The Cost of Being Black in America. In his book, Rochester painstakingly examines how economic losses originating from racism and discrimination have cost black Americans trillions of dollars over several generations, amounting to a whopping $70 trillion. The considerable racial wealth gap that is evident today is largely the result of this prejudice. The roots of the wealth divide can be seen in the 250 years that Africans in slavery worked for no pay. Although it is difficult to pinpoint the precise worth of this slave labor, estimates of the money taken from black slaves between 1619 and 1865 range from $24 to $97 trillion. In his computations, Rochester uses an average amount of $50 trillion. Black Americans own only approximately 2% of U.S. wealth, despite having labored to construct the country and being denied a share of this riches. Black Americans have historically been routinely shut out of government-sponsored initiatives aimed at generating wealth. For example, they were excluded from the Homestead Act of 1863, which gave residents access to 160 acres of property in return for a small fee and 5 years of land cultivation. Homesteaders, mostly of white descent, claimed 270 million acres over a 70-year period, valued at $1.6 trillion. In addition, Black Americans lost $143 billion as a result of the 1995 Social Security Act exclusion, and an additional $45 billion as a result of the 1944 G-Bill denial of benefits to Black soldiers. This is a friendly reminder to subscribe to our channel, and like the video if you would like us to continue making videos for you. We need your help to establish a thriving community. Now let's go on. Even when African Americans tried to start enterprises in wealthy networks, advancement was blocked or obliterated, frequently with the use of force. A horrific example is the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, in which a white mob set fire to black-owned shops in Tulsa, Oklahoma's affluent Greenwood district. The ongoing wealth disparity was exacerbated by these disruptions and the low-paying employment that were assigned to black people. Black Americans experienced racial and economic segregation during this time, as shown by Rochester's $70 trillion estimate, which accounts for losses suffered during the Jim Crow and civil rights eras, reducing their involvement in the U.S. economy. The wealth disparity between whites and blacks is considerable at the moment, with the average white family owning almost 10 times more wealth than the average black household. In particular, white college graduates are significantly wealthier than their black counterparts by a factor of almost 7. The U.S. government must make amends for historical wrongs by giving reparations to Black Americans' descendants if it is to genuinely realize the American dream as an egalitarian reality. Cash contributions made to each individual in a way that reduces the wealth gap between races should be the form of reparations. These reparations should also include wealth-building programs that address inequalities in housing, education, and company ownership. The labor worth of African Americans in slavery was believed to have exceeded $3 billion in 1860, more than the total value of railroad and factory investments. The value of the cotton produced by people in slavery in 1861 was $250 million. In addition to enriching white slave owners, this significant wealth created by slavery fueled the country's economy and prevented enslaved people from accumulating wealth. Black Americans who were born into slavery have never been paid for their labor, and the federal government has never restored the equity that was lost as a result of anti-black business, housing, and transportation laws. A history of discriminatory tactics, including redlining, Jim Crow segregation, and enslavement, have consistently denied African Americans the chance to accumulate money. The racial wealth gap cannot be closed by only supporting individual effort and behavioral improvement. This is demonstrated by the fact that white high school dropouts have greater wealth than black college graduates. Reparations are sometimes written off as an unrealistic tactic. Reparations are not new to the United States, as evidenced by the country's history with them. In order to make up for their forced removal from their ancestral grounds, Native Americans have been granted land as well as large financial compensation through a number of benefits and programs. Reparations to Japanese Americans for their incarceration during World War II totaled $1.5 billion. In addition, the United States government contributed significantly to the Marshall Plan's long-term expenditures in support of Holocaust survivors, while West Germany pledged in 1952 to provide 3.45 billion Deutsche Marks in reparations to survivors of the Holocaust. While enslavement allowed some white families to amass enormous riches, Black Americans remain the only group that has not received reparations for state-sanctioned racial discrimination. The United States was repeatedly denied the chance to realize the American dream, despite having multiple opportunities to confront the legacy of slavery. The 40 acres and mule policy was first presented, then later withdrawn. There was a critical window of opportunity for the United States to make amends for slavery, right after the Civil War. Leaders of the Union, such as General William Sherman, pushed for the allocation of 40 acres of property to every African American family. Field Order 15 was issued by General Sherman, giving black households 400,000 acres of Confederate land that had been taken. Some of these families also received mules. But following President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson reversed Field Order 15, giving the land back to the former slave owners. Rather than giving African Americans the means to support themselves, the federal government gave former slave owners more power. In several cases, former slave owners received compensation for the property they had while they were in slavery. With few job opportunities, many African Americans went back to work as sharecroppers on the same farm, essentially working for the same people who had enslaved them. Later in the 1930s, as the country struggled to recover from the Great Depression and the 1929 stock market crash, the New Deal came into being. The New Deal was put into effect by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it contained measures that were estimated to have cost $50 billion at the time, or nearly $50 trillion in modern dollars. Racial inequities were not sufficiently addressed by the GI Bill and Social Security, two essential components of the New Deal. Due to local GI Bill implementation that was hampered by racial housing restrictions and redlining, Black World War II soldiers were not able to fully utilize post-war benefits like their white counterparts. Farm and domestic workers were two professions that Social Security did not include, despite the fact that they could have greatly increased equality in America. This exclusion essentially made 60% of black workers in the United States and 75% of black workers in southern states who work in these occupations marginalized. In order to help the predominantly white population during the Great Depression, these measures were inserted into the act at the expense of black veterans and laborers. Although other oppressed groups have received reparations, Black Americans have never received the same kind of relief from the federal government. The United States has to implement a comprehensive federal reparations plan for Black Americans in order to meet its commitment to narrowing the wealth disparity between races and respecting the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The inability of the U.S. government to accumulate such a substantial sum has allowed them to avoid making reparations payments. But now that there is a workable solution, the only excuse for not paying reparations is malice. Extraction of money from wealthy people and land from previous slave owners must be the main idea. It has never been simpler to trace this out than it is now. It is possible to locate the descendants of former slave owners by tracking down their riches and land. After then, taxes may be levied against them in order to create a reparations fund. It is possible and practical to compensate. It hasn't, however, gotten the attention it merits. The fact that the majority of white Americans oppose reparations that express racial views is troubling. A moral litmus test is to reject the idea of giving up land and income inherited from former slave owners. They refuse to make restitution. Instead, they wish to keep the wealth that was accumulated as a result of exploitation. It begs the question of how African Americans would fare and prosper in a nation that recognizes only white Americans as its citizens. Representative Cori Bush just introduced a measure in May 2023 that addresses reparations for African Americans. The bill calls for $14 trillion in restitution to rectify the harm caused by slavery during the Jim Crow era. This latest plan, dubbed the Reparations Now Bill, is an addition to the many prior initiatives by Democratic lawmakers to make up for the historical injustices that African Americans have endured over many years. A Reuters poll found that only 18% of Republicans agreed with the majority of Democrats, or roughly 58%, who said they were in favor of reparations. Furthermore, according to the report, 74% of Black Americans and 26% of white Americans support reparations. The California legislature received the final report from the task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. This in-depth analysis looked at the long-term effects of slavery on African Americans and the suffering that resulted, which is still present in American culture. The report outlines over 115 recommendations for redressing the injustices suffered by those impacted, and it proposes a thorough reparations scheme. Although the report supported financial compensation for those affected, it did not provide a specific number, leaving lawmakers to determine the appropriate amount. Now, what are your thoughts? Will restitution for slavery be made, or is it only a theoretical concept? What if the American government declared it would be making reparations for slavery? Are you in favor of it? Please share your opinions with us in the space provided for comments below. Do you think we should produce more videos? If so, kindly help us out by clicking the bell icon and becoming a subscriber to our channel. Additional videos are available for viewing on our channel.